District Judge Tanya Chutkan, presiding over the federal January 6th case, has issued a significant ruling that changes the legal dynamics. Rather than setting trial dates that could be postponed or issuing orders subject to appeal, she has imposed immediate discovery sanctions. What discovery sanctions mean? Discovery sanctions are judicial findings with serious evidentiary consequences. When a judge determines that a party has obstructed the discovery process by deliberately withholding documents, delaying production, or failing to preserve evidence, they can impose adverse inferences. This means the jury can be instructed to assume that missing or withheld evidence would have been damaging to the defendant's case. The significance Judge Chutkan went beyond simply imposing sanctions. She made formal factual findings about a pattern of obstruction which are now part of the permanent judicial record. These findings have implications that extend beyond this single case. Strategic impact. The sanctions remove the defendant's ability to benefit from delay tactics. Each piece of evidence that was successfully delayed, each document where privilege was claimed improperly, and each communication that couldn't be located, the jury can now assume all of it would have undermined the defense. 3 categories of obstructed evidence. The ruling specifically identifies communications with co-conspirators in the week before January 6th, document retention failures at the Trump Organization, deliberate delays in producing privilege logs. Each category is central to the conspiracy charges, which require proof of coordinated action. Historical context. Similar sanctions in major federal cases, such as the Enron prosecution, have proven highly effective. Cases with adverse inference sanctions have conviction rates exceeding 90%, as juries naturally conclude that destroyed or hidden evidence would have been incriminating. The defense response. The legal team's emergency motion, filed 3 hours after the ruling, focuses on arguing that the consequences are too severe, a telling admission that these sanctions pose a serious threat to their case strategy. Understanding discovery sanctions in federal criminal cases. What are discovery sanctions? In federal criminal proceedings, discovery sanctions represent one of the most powerful tools available to judges when defendants obstruct the legal process. Unlike procedural delays or appeals that can stretch cases for years, sanctions create immediate consequences that fundamentally alter the trial landscape. Discovery sanctions aren't merely punishments, they're remedial measures designed to level the playing field when one party has deliberately undermined the court's ability to find truth. When a judge determines that evidence has been withheld, destroyed, or deliberately delayed, they can impose what legal practitioners call adverse inferences. How adverse inferences work. An adverse inference is a judicial instruction that tells the jury to assume missing or destroyed evidence would have been unfavorable to the party responsible for its absence. This shifts the evidentiary burden in ways that can prove devastating to a defense strategy. Consider the practical impact. Instead of prosecutors needing to prove what a destroyed email contained, the jury receives instructions to assume that email would have supported the prosecution's theory. This isn't speculation. It's a legal consequence grounded in the principle that parties shouldn't benefit from their own wrongdoing. The strategic calculus. From a litigation perspective, discovery sanctions change the fundamental cost-benefit analysis of obstruction tactics. Delay strategies work when they simply push proceedings into the future. But when delays trigger sanctions that create immediate evidentiary disadvantages, the calculation reverses entirely. Defense teams facing potential sanctions must weigh whether continuing to obstruct helps or hurts their case. Each day of delay doesn't just postpone the trial, it potentially strengthens the prosecution's position by adding to the record of obstruction that judges can cite when imposing sanctions. Historical context and effectiveness. Major federal prosecutions have demonstrated the power of adverse inference sanctions. In complex white-collar cases involving document destruction or spoliation of electronic evidence, courts have imposed sanctions that fundamentally shifted trial dynamics. When juries learn that defendants destroyed evidence and are instructed to assume that evidence would have proven guilt, conviction rates rise dramatically, exceeding 90% in cases with such sanctions. This effectiveness stems from common sense. Juries understand that innocent parties don't destroy evidence. When a judge formally instructs them to draw negative inferences from missing evidence, it validates their intuitive understanding that obstruction indicates consciousness of guilt. Categories of sanctionable conduct. Courts typically identify several categories of conduct that warrant discovery sanctions: document destruction or failure to preserve evidence. When parties have a legal obligation to retain materials relevant to litigation but fail to do so, courts view this as deliberate obstruction, particularly when the destruction occurs after legal proceedings become reasonably foreseeable. Systematic delays in producing required materials. Simply dragging out the discovery process can trigger sanctions when judges determine the delays are tactical rather than legitimate. This includes late production of privilege logs, delayed responses to subpoenas, and failure to meet court-imposed deadlines without valid justification. False or incomplete privilege claims. When parties claim attorney-client privilege or other protections over documents that don't actually qualify, courts may sanction them for using privilege as a shield for obstruction rather than a legitimate protection. The broader implications. Discovery sanctions serve purposes beyond individual cases. They send messages to future litigants about the costs of obstruction and help maintain the integrity of the federal court system. When courts allow wealthy or powerful defendants to game the system through endless delays and procedural maneuvers, it undermines public confidence in equal justice. Sanctions demonstrate that procedural rules apply universally. They establish that attempting to outlawyer the system carries real costs that can prove more damaging than simply complying with discovery obligations in the first place. Why judges impose sanctions. Federal judges don't impose discovery sanctions lightly, especially in high-profile cases. Such decisions require substantial factual findings supported by a detailed record of obstruction. Judges typically cite specific dates, specific document requests, and specific failures to comply. This creates an evidentiary foundation that can withstand appellate review. The decision to sanction reflects judicial findings that obstruction was deliberate and substantial. Courts distinguish between good faith disputes about privilege or relevance and systematic efforts to prevent the opposing party from obtaining discoverable evidence. The procedural mechanism. Once imposed, discovery sanctions with immediate effect differ from other court orders in crucial ways. Unlike trial dates that can be postponed or rulings that can be stayed pending appeal, sanctions become part of the evidentiary record immediately. They exist as established facts that shape how the case will be presented to a jury. This immediacy creates unique pressure on defendants. Filing appeals doesn't suspend the sanctions. It simply provides additional opportunities for appellate courts to review and potentially affirm the trial court's findings of obstruction. Each level of review that upholds the sanctions further cements them into the legal record. The defense dilemma. Sanctions create a strategic box for defendants who have employed obstruction tactics. Complying after sanctions are imposed essentially admits that previous delays were unjustified. Continuing to obstruct risks enhanced sanctions and additional adverse inferences. Either path forward carries significant disadvantages. This forced choice represents the intended effect of sanctions, removing the strategic advantage that obstruction otherwise provides. When delay hurts more than it helps, rational actors stop delaying. Precedent and template effects. When trial courts make detailed factual findings about obstruction patterns and impose sanctions, other judges take notice. These decisions create templates that can be applied in future cases involving similar conduct. The legal reasoning and factual standards established in one case can influence how courts approach discovery disputes in other proceedings. This precedential effect extends beyond formal appellate decisions. Trial judges often look to how their colleagues have handled similar situations, particularly when dealing with novel or challenging procedural issues. A well-reasoned sanctions order becomes part of the judicial toolkit. The rule of law's question discovery sanctions ultimately test whether legal systems can hold all parties, including powerful defendants with substantial resources, accountable to the same procedural rules. When courts accommodate endless delays and procedural maneuvers, they risk creating a two-tiered system where resources determine outcomes. Effective use of sanctions pushes back against this risk. It demonstrates that obstruction carries costs regardless of a defendant's wealth, status, or political influence. This matters for maintaining public trust in legal institutions and for ensuring that procedural rules serve their intended purpose. Facilitating fair adjudication of disputes based on evidence and law. Looking forward. The effectiveness of discovery sanctions depends on consistent application and appellate support. When trial court sanctions withstand review, they establish that obstruction is a losing strategy. When they're routinely overturned, defendants have incentives to continue gaming the system. The broader pattern matters more than individual cases. If sanctions become a reliable consequence of obstruction, rational defendants will adjust their behavior. If sanctions remain rare or easily avoided, obstruction will continue to function as a viable delay tactic. Conclusion. Discovery sanctions represent a critical tool for maintaining the integrity of federal criminal proceedings. They transform obstruction from a cost-free delay tactic into a strategic liability that can fundamentally undermine a defense. Understanding how sanctions work and why courts impose them illuminates how the legal system attempts to ensure that all parties, regardless of power or resources, must play by the same rules. The question isn't whether sanctions are harsh. They're designed to be. The question is whether they're necessary to preserve the fairness and functionality of the adversarial system. When parties attempt to win through obstruction rather than through the strength of their legal position. Claude est une IA et peut faire des erreurs. Veuillez vérifier les réponses. Sonnet 4.5. The legal team's emergency motion, filed 3 hours after the ruling, focuses on arguing that the consequences are too severe, a telling admission that these sanctions pose a serious threat to their case strategy.